What's a social enterprise and why do I care? This is the first of 3 episodes of a short mini-series. And I'm Matthew Bellringer, and I'm joined by Adrian Ashton and Anita Toze to really explore this and get into it. So, when you hear social enterprise, what's the first thing that you think about? We've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this, and this is the definition that we're going to be using today. So it's an organization which trades and uses its assets in order to do good things and does so in an ongoing way. So, Adrian, in particular, I'd really like to ask you kind of what are the other definitions? This is just our one. So why is it so hard to define in the first place?
I think because it's a concept. It's not a specific thing you can point to and say, for example, that's a charity. Charities have existed for centuries, or millennia even, have an established culture and an identity. Social enterprise, by contrast, has only really been around as a defined concept as we have it today for a couple of decades. So we're still feeling our way around it. And as we'll kind of be exploring through this series, it can come in lots of different flavors and formats and shapes and sizes. So as a result, the way that we define it. So for example, you could go to Social Enterprise UK as the sector body, and they have a definition. Or you could say, actually, I'm an academic, I'm researching this. So let me go to the universities. They have a slightly different definition. Now, although we're focusing on the UK primarily through this set of series, you could say, well, actually, I'm going to be transnational. And in other countries, they have other definitions still because the legislation is different. But like I said, Matthew, for the purposes of this series, we wanted to kind of nail our colours to the mast, if only temporarily, to anchor these conversations and create a good focus to hang them all onto.
Brilliant. And so we're going to be talking about really the kind of the legal structures and the organizational structures that make up a social enterprise, and exploring why they're put together that way, how they came about, and then looking at really how that relates to what we're trying to do as individuals, and to exploring that. And obviously we're going to have 3 episodes to do that. The first one, we're going to pick apart social enterprise and structure. The second one, we're going to look at really how you can break it down and look at your particular situation and apply that to you. And in the final episode, we're going to be using a real world example, and a little bit more about that in a minute. I think the really tricky thing for me is how all of these things overlap and engage, and they all kind of have these dependencies, and it's quite a lot to take on. So we're going to be trying to make it a bit more easy and amenable to just get some an initial understanding and get a grounding, so you can then explore and go in depth a bit further later on. But this isn't just about taking our word for it. This is about engaging and saying we're all presenting our own opinion, and so it is hopefully just a prompt for you to explore and understand more further. So why should you actually bother to listen to us? What is it that that means that we do have something worth considering, let alone listening to, about this topic? Adrian, if I could let you introduce yourself a little bit first, maybe, then we can go through the rest of this.
So, dear listener or viewer, if you're tuned into this podcast episode, video series, it's not to hear my life story. That's why God gave us the internet. So stick my name into Google, image search, social media, see what comes up. But for the purposes of this series, the reason why I think Matthew and Anita think that these are a safe pair of hands to be sharing the screen with you is because for many of the social enterprise sector bodies and the people within them, I am their go-to guy for questions about social enterprise structure, form, identity, and that governance piece as well, the relationships that are structured within those.
Great, thank you. And Anita, how about you?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Adrian, really. And me and Matthew have turned to you as well for sort of the advice and and with the viewers willing to really explore this topic together in that sense. And I work as a psychotherapist, background in psychology, really. And, we cannot look at this without taking into account that interaction requires people. So, what it means to do this, is this important for me, the values behind it, and yeah, the fears as well. So, yeah, let's see where we get with it.
Super, thank you. And for those of you who don't know me or don't entirely know how I relate to this particular subject, I'm an innovation guide and neurodiversity advocate, and I particularly work with meaningful work and meaningful innovation, and that's a huge part of this as relates to social enterprise and just to doing things differently and figuring out how we do that better, and using the technology to do that, and developing technology as well, and using that in service of people and what we want to achieve. And part of the reason, or perhaps the reason we're specifically talking about this right now, is that Anita and I are in the process of setting up a social enterprise, and we are doing this series in part to get more understanding ourselves, and to really get a better picture ourselves, and in part because it's directly relevant to the kind of people that I work with and supporting those people as well. It's something that's a challenge that, or one of the possible ways that many of them want to explore in terms of how they can do their thing. We're going to talk mostly about that in the third and final episode, so I'm not going to go into too many details now.
I have to wait until then to get.
You have to wait. You'll have to tune in for the third episode.
Patience.
So yeah, it wouldn't make sense anyway. You can't jump ahead that far. So instead, we're going to be focusing today on really the people who are, who are maybe thinking about what it is to do something different, to create something that we came up with the definition of people who want to create something to meaningfully engage with the problems that they themselves face. And that's the situation that I'm in, and Anita's in, and that we're working with this particular thing. And to get some clarity amongst all of the noise and all of these ideas and everything that everyone thinks we should do. And there's so much advice out there. And my personal experience is that I couldn't get to the bottom of any of it. It all seemed like contradictory, a bit weird. It didn't quite make sense. And I felt completely overwhelmed with all of the stuff and all of the advice that I was given. So this is part of me kind of trying to figure this one out for myself as well as for everyone else. And Adrian was kind enough to volunteer when I asked for help around this. So and we decided to put together a piece of content because it really is. It's a challenge a lot of people face. We couldn't find anything really that directly spoke to this. It's particularly interesting, I think, if you are thinking about establishing a new organization or perhaps transitioning an existing one into a different operating model, and to see how that goes. And it's also entirely relevant if you are either making policy or running an organization, in leadership in an organization, and you want to support others in doing this, and you want to understand how you might be able to do that more fully. Is there anything else in terms of who this is for that either of you would like to add?
Yes, my mum and dad. They're always very proud of me, always very excited whenever I appear anywhere. So hello, mum and dad.
So yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Adrian. We'll make sure to personally share it.
So for me, I really find this, it's such a tangle. I use the word wicked problem quite a lot, which is kind of a technical phrase, but it is just this tangle where you pull on one bit and then another bit gets tighter, and it just feels like you can never fully untangle it. And there's so much advice out there, but none of it feels like it covers the whole picture and it works all the way through. I've been working in this space for a long time, and so often you take a path and you can adopt something, and you realize after a ton of effort and a ton of time and energy devoted to it, that suddenly this isn't going to work for me for some kind of really frustrating reason. And part of the reason to do this and consider this now is so that that doesn't happen. Hopefully we can avoid the worst of that. For me, this is made even more difficult when you're actually working with exactly the kind of problems that you want to that you understand the best, because you're the subject of those problems. You experience those problems, and yet that prevents you from working in this way. And for me, an awful lot of the value of social enterprise is to be able to actually solve our own problems. It's a different approach. It's not going and kind of being an authority or getting help in the kind of traditional sense. It's much more around helping ourselves, but that brings with it its own set of difficulties. And plus, if there were obvious ways to solve all this stuff, I'm sure someone would have done it already. A lot of this is actually about exploring how we do this when it isn't obvious, when it is tangled, when it is messy, and how we can set up structure that supports us in doing that rather than structure that limits us. So I think I'd really like to talk a bit more about why it's personally important to do this kind of meaningful work and explore this stuff. But perhaps I think Anita's probably better placed to talk about this than I am. So could you talk a little bit about that, please?
All right. Well, so I think the question probably is sort of why meaningful work matters, and to actually be very clear about it, it doesn't matter to everyone, and that's okay too. And I think for those who, for whom it does matter, I think it's sort of this idea that we are part of something bigger, what often people refer to, that I want to be part of something bigger, as, we have started this life and we end this life, with others. And we come in this world sort of as a result of others, and we are cared by others. And there's sort of this just natural extension. It just feels so normal to really feel like I want to be part of this whole organism in that sense. But yeah, the first thing is if someone finds it very meaningful, then a kind of very important to perhaps explore it and follow this voice again. And actually from early age, we're not always encouraged to look at ourselves as sort of being part of a bigger system. We are often not encouraged what it means and how important that is, and we are very much focusing on building certain things, not really asking why we are doing so. And that can happen that at some point and at some stage in life, a person realizes, well, what I'm doing no longer satisfies me. I cannot find meaning. I cannot find purpose in this. And that could sort of be significant, as it could indicate that there is a cycle that needs to be closed and a new cycle needs to open. And I really want to sort of as well encourage people, and this has been as well sort of in my own journey, to really be brave in life when facing these cycles, and perhaps realizing when something is no longer working and letting go, and really being brave in exploring new things, and looking at the values and looking at what is important for the individual. And that can be very different as to what are the values. It is very, very individual. So the question why, again, so that's very, very personal. And probably some of the main things that come to mind is sometimes people want to, the planet is important, or helping other people, or making systems more efficient. So there are many ways how we can feel and experience that we are being part of something bigger. Or, it can be smaller communities, families. I hope I'm kind of clarifying a bit the question, but let me know if.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that idea of, really that it's a very personal thing, and that makes it difficult. There isn't a one size fits all. There isn't a, and for those of us who find that the existing approaches don't entirely work for us, that's the tricky bit. And I think that's a large degree what we're what we're looking at here. Everyone has a different array of strengths and weaknesses, and it's a question partly of using that strength well. I think, Adrian, we chatted about why it's important to make a living doing work that feels good, or at least doesn't feel shameful, doesn't create regret.
There's because one of the things I think would be horrendous for anyone is to be embarrassed by what you do. But there's a balance to be had. We have to pay our rent and eat food and buy food, but we don't want to feel we're being, an undesirable, an unmutual within that relationship somehow. If, for example, if I wouldn't want my kids to feel embarrassed by who I am and what I do, unless I'm wearing a mankini and it's just some kind of whimsical thing. But in terms of that sense of my legacy, my identity, as Anita was sharing, how we connect with other people, how other people view us and we view them and relate together, is really important. And I think Anita's right, we don't spend enough time thinking about that. And social enterprise can offer us a route through which we can, like I said, pull on some of those chords, try and unpick them a little bit and reweave them together in a way that makes sense for us, helps us, and actually helps those around us and the wider planet as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think for me, it's always a question, particularly, my personal preference of structure is, I'd rather not, thanks. My default response. So, I think it's a really important question about why would we want to engage with all of the, the structural stuff that we're talking about, the technical stuff at all?
Well, and you're right. I think it's one of these things where we put it off because we don't feel qualified to talk about it. So legal structure, that's all the accountants and the solicitors and the barristers, and I don't have any of that knowledge or training. So I feel out of my depth. I feel like an imposter. So I'll just avoid it completely. And I'll just, if someone else sounds that they're saying I should be this, and that kind of, they seem confident and that it kind of seems to make sense how they're explaining it, I'll probably go with that. But the risk is those people advising us, as you've mentioned earlier, don't have to live with it. They don't have to sleep with this thing we create. They don't wake up with it. They're not accountable for it in the way that we are. So I think what I always say to people is this is an important conversation to figure out what form should you have the three planks as we've kind of got highlighted here, because one is about what do you want to protect? Because this thing you're setting up as a social enterprise, hopefully, will outlive you. So what in it should be sacrosanct? What should be protected and never be able to be changed? Because as other people join you, that'll be diluted and you'll go through. So how do you protect that core vision? The second is, as well, it's about how do we engage? Goes back to that point Anita was saying, we're connected with other people. And the identity, the form we adopt as a social enterprise comes with baggage. Other people have different understandings, and we'll pick into that definitely in the second episode a bit more. But the way we present ourselves as such is perceived by other people differently. So we're kind of preventing doing that. And then also it's about allowing us to do what we want to, how we want to. And again, as we'll pick up through the series, some legal forms allow you essentially to print your own money. Others say you can only do these specific things and that's it ever. And others say you must include those people. Others say you have to. So what's important, and there's an adage as well, for example, there's an adage that form follows function. So what I would always say is we can't actually define what your most best fit legal model would be until we know more about how is this model of the enterprise that the two of you are creating, how should that work? How should the money flow within it? How do you want the governance and the relationships to work? And then we can look at form. But the idea of this series is we're kind of laying it out as these foundation pieces so that when you do come to make that decision, all the blocks are there ready to be snapped together in the best configuration.
Absolutely. That idea of a firm foundation of structure to support you in what you're trying to do, rather than a set of rules that you have to kind of abide by to participate. For me, it's the way that when it is the healthy reframing when I'm annoyed by structure and rules and things that are forms I have to fill in and that kind of thing. But the closer you can be and the more confident you can be that the thing is actually serving you, the less burdensome those things feel. And usually the easier they are to actually fill in correctly and do and participate in as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can just add, what I think I heard a little bit was that we kind of have to imagine how it would look on a daily basis, the interactions, the things we would do, how things would be handled, and then apply sort of the structure that would be the best fit, rather than trying to fit the work into a certain structure so that follows. Yeah.
And that's it, because when and this, like, we've got the prompt here on the screen now. How do we, what happens if we don't get it right? What happens if we get it right? That's the best case now. If we get it right, we're not going to notice anything. It's just going to flow. Like you say, Anita, it will work in the way that you want it to work. If you don't get the right form, it means you can't access the finance you thought you could or you needed to. It means the relationships you want to have can't be structured in the way that you want to. It means you may not have the flexibility to change what you offer as a traded service or product in the future. It means things clog up and come crashing down and just lock up and gets very painful. And the worst thing is, you probably won't realize that's happening until it's too late. When the regulator suddenly knocks on the door and goes, here's your fine, here's your prosecution, here's your letter of cease and desist, because you're starting to operate illegally without realizing it. And then in that kind of slur, that tarnishing to your reputation will extend into your community and everything you've been trying to do. And it just undermines that change that we're trying to create as well.
And the other side from me is to making a viable organisation from a financial perspective, from a resourcing perspective. And the other way that this goes wrong is if it all becomes too much. You can't, it becomes too difficult to run, to make a functional organisation, and so you run out of resources, and you can't do that, whatever the good is, anymore. And so it's about being able to meet those requirements and do that. It's the other part of the ongoingness for me. Is making sure that the structure supports the sustaining functions of the organisation, the stuff that keeps it going, and supports the people that work in it too. Particularly in this case, because we're talking largely about people who are, very often people helping themselves, and we want it to be supportive. We want it to help more rather than be an obstacle, a further obstacle in many cases. So if we weave all this together, I think, we've all at some point in our careers often worked with the idea or encountered the idea of imposter syndrome. All three of us specifically in our work, which is a really interesting one. I know Adrian's recently published a book about it and engaging with it. And this is kind of going to be an exploration of our doubt, an exploration of what we know and what we don't know. And I think that's a really important part of it. So I think it's probably time to go into the specifics of what we want to explore. Unless anyone has anything else they want to add.
No, I think it's a case of strap in, gang, and follow through. The other thing as well, in terms of, because we're doing this on camera as a pre-record as well. I'm kind of realizing I'm in the unusual position that where I kind of live and am at the moment, the sun is actually coming out, and the neighbor has parked one of their cars in such a way that it looks like I've got a weird kind of inverse tattoo moving across my head. It's not really. There's nothing kind of trying to break out of me. It's just a bit of unfortunate lighting. So hopefully it won't distract you too much as we go along.
Well, this is an exercise in real world stuff. I think it's we're not talking about ideals and perfect things. We're talking about what's actually going on. So it's
Exactly.
entirely appropriate.
Yeah, and it suits you, Adrian. Don't worry.
Thank you. Well, we'll see how it moves around, and whether I should have it I should get it tattooed to kind of fix on a bit. Anyway,
Yeah, we'll see. I mean,
Make sure you keep it in the center.
for continuity's sake, you know, we're going to do 2 more episodes, so we need to make sure that you've got that there. But speaking of continuity, in a really awkward segue, so the one of the really big things about all these legal forms is that they are structures that have evolved over time. You know, there's this huge history behind all of them, and that implies a lot about how they're thought about and how they're used and the assumptions they make about the world and how it works and how people do good and all of these different things. So I think it's probably going to be helpful to really kind of cluster these together into a few high level things, because there are lots of kind of sub things, but just to get the high level overview first of all, and probably to start with the oldest common remaining form, which is charities. So, Adrian, could you tell us a bit more about charities and where they come from?
We kind of had a thought between the three of us how we could best introduce these forms and start to play with them and explore them a bit. And I was showing that one of the approaches that I've taken that seems to people find least painful, because actually if you dig into this, there are about 16 different options. So I kind of look at it thanks to my history teacher at school, Mr. Lang, who gave me a lifelong love of history. I'm always interested in the history of something. So in terms of this timeline we've got here, you know, most people think about social enterprise, we think about charities. That's because they've been around the longest. So in terms of a timeline, 1601, charity legislation, that's where we start to see the basis of what we now recognize as modern charities. And charities are set up to be benevolent and paternalistic, doing good things for other people. Now, charities can trade, but there are hard limits on that, because they have a lot of preferential treatment in the law in terms of how they can raise funding through philanthropic means and grants, how they're exempt from certain taxes, but they come under greater scrutiny. There's a greater standard in terms of their governance. The people who are involved in them should not benefit economically from them. So we skip forward a bit and we say, well, actually, the counterpoint then emerges with cooperatives. Cooperatives have been around for millennia. 1852, though, is a key point, because 1852 is the first time we have a legislative act that creates a legal structure for cooperatives that is based on their model and identity, and crucially, their values. So society law is introduced, and cooperative societies are the only legal form where the regulator also asks questions about that enterprise's values, not financial values, but social values, community values, relationship values. How well is that enterprise actually trading and structuring to reflect those?
So just to kind of get a sense of the two in comparison to each other, the charities is very much about helping other people. You know, it's you know, we are helping. You know, in the intent behind it anyway, is to help, or you know, or other things, other beings, other systems, or whatever it is. But it's us. It's we care, but it's not us helping ourselves. Whereas the cooperative model or the society model is much more about a kind of mutual support thing.
Yeah, we are going to take control of our own destiny. We're not going to be dependent upon the goodwill and the generosity of someone else. We're accountable to ourselves. If it works, we're responsible. We can celebrate that. We can collectively benefit from that. And that speaks to that point Anita was sharing earlier about our identity, our need to be connected with other people and working together. So that's kind of takes the cooperatives, and that's for me as well. I always kind of say that's an interesting point, because that kind of where we, as a sector, as a movement, government was lobbied and introduced a legal form around social enterprise, which is anyway. Fast forward a little bit, we get to 1985, Companies Act 1985. Most people will go, well, why that year in particular? There's lots of other Companies Acts, because 1985 passed into legislation the ability for a company any legal limited company by guarantee, shares or public shares, to entrench, to lock in a social purpose and say this company has been established for a social purpose. This company must use its assets in pursuit of that social purpose, in the same way that a charity does and is regulated to. Companies can now do the same, but they don't have all the financial benefits of being a charity, but they do have the flexibility over their trading and their governance in comparison. And so that's the point that we start to see a lot of kind of these what's become known as social enterprises. So back then it was more about community businesses or new wave cooperatives suddenly saying, oh, we now have a way of actually holding our purpose, our identity in the legal form to protect it and to be flexible enough. So it kind of unleashes a wave of interest then. That's happening. And then the last one on that point, that to bring us up to date in terms of key dates, would be the introduction of the Community Interest Company, 2005. Because, and it's on the chart here, because this is when the government said, we think we as a government should be doing more to encourage social enterprises. And one of the ways we think we can do that is to give them a new legal form. Interestingly, not because the sector was saying we need a new legal form, but it's and there wasn't this in our session. There's a whole raft of other initiatives that government brought in. What became social investment tax relief, and other things as well came along. But we've got these points in the history. And, Anita, you and I were chatting earlier as well about this. And part of the reason there's all this confusion, I think, about legal forms and identities is because we start in 1601, we go through to 2005. There's never really been a good tidy up on the statute books as we've gone along. Every time, so kicks have been introduced, but they've not taken anything out or replaced anything. So all the other options are still there, and these are added on and added on and added on. And that is, again, that analogy Matthew's saying about the knots and the confusions about, well, we're going to follow this trail and where does it go? Oh, well, that overlaps with this. Now, maybe we just need to kind of hit a hard reset on the government and just reset all our legislation and then actually start with a viewer list. But this is kind of the way that I suggest it can be useful to approach thinking about this, to say, what are the main options? How have they come to be? And how do they start to compare and contrast with each other? Particularly around the idea of control and purpose and protection and financing as well.
And Anita, it's been taking the lead on kind of exploring this for us in our social enterprise, and have done a lot of exploration. So I think I'd be really interested to hear, how has your experience of coming into something like this, from not having a huge amount of background knowledge about it, been? What's it like?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to answer the question in a second as well. I wanted to say what I've as well gathered from Adrian is that there's kind of a bit of a mess there, and it feels like, cleaning up and reorganizing would be great, but the reality is,
I'll get me feather duster out. I'll go and have a bit of a spruik up
now. I'm waiting. And but it's I think, we have to sort of acknowledge and accept that this is what it is right now, and try to really make sort of, some sense out of it, and what might work. And I think what really helpful to look at this today together with Adrian from sort of a historical perspective as well, which is really is I never really thought about it that way in a sense, but of course reading through the papers, it does come across that, we need a bit of improvement, let's add something like this, let's add that, and it is mentioned sort of in the papers. And I think for anyone who is sort of looking to establish or to transition into sort of more this type of enterprise, or as well, just to want to learn more, will have to go through quite a lot of reading to understand. But for me,
all they have to do is listen to this 3-part mini-series.
Absolutely. That's it. Solves all the problems.
just that. But true, it's been there's a lot of information out there, but to be honest, there is this part where you feel you have to read through a lot of irrelevant stuff as well. And it's challenging, but I think that first first thing is a bit of that fear. It's of overcoming that fear and really getting to it, and just starting somewhere to read about it, really any point, and maybe not thinking too much where exactly to start, but starting anywhere, and sort of it will just help to it will guide you to the other point, and just really be open to following it a bit sort of sporadically, but taking some notes, and over time sort of it starts to make some sense, and that can be a very individual process. Yeah.
And Anita, that point about taking notes, whatever you're reading, whatever you're listening to, is really crucial, not just for the note taking, but what you do with the note, which is go and ask other people, reach out through your networks, be part of groups. We're part of this. We'll talk about the Good Business Club later. Find a community and ask them, who else has come across this? What have you understood by it? How have you approached it and wrestled with it and figured it out for your context? Because that can help speak to us in our context, to kind of transpose that and to figure out how do we make sense of it for us here today.
Exactly. So I think seeking out communities, that is great. And again, just starting at any step anywhere, because you don't have to figure out all the 10 steps. You don't have to figure out how it's going to look. Once you take the first step, it will be clear what the second step is, what it looks like. So don't think about, standing on the first step, don't think about, oh my God, how am I going to get to the 10th? How am I going to get there? So just start. Remember, once you're going to be on the 8th, the 10th will seem closer. It will be a better picture there. So just go step by step.
Absolutely. I think for me, the key, though, is really understanding, and the huge part with communities is actually that sharing of experience and figuring out, okay, well, I felt this way, or I feel this way, I experience it this way. And so someone else felt similarly and they approached it this way. How did that go? Was that the right thing, or was that unhelpful? So you can hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls that people have previously. And this is one of the huge challenges with doing anything different, is the space, the possibilities around not something is an infinite space. And so it's overwhelming. And I think being able to reduce some of your options actually and start narrowing it down is a really, really helpful thing. And I'd really like to, just as kind of a sanity check at this point, really like to explore whether a social enterprise is actually what you in the audience want, whether that is probably a helpful vehicle, or whether it's actually about thinking about other things.
Yeah. So this is kind of where I come in with the homework that I've done in readiness for this session, dear viewer, listener, whoever you are. And so a few years ago, I was involved working on a project which said we almost we had to come up with a universal definition of social enterprise. And as we picked up earlier in this conversation, the difficulty is everyone has their own approach, their own understanding. So what I did previously was I went through all of the national social enterprise sector bodies and wrote down their definitions. I went through every government department, every grant-making trust who fund social enterprise, wrote down their definitions. I then went to all the universities who teach and research social enterprise, the social enterprise regional partnerships and networks, and they all coalesce around these 3 points that are on screen now. So this is what we call the acid test. A social enterprise. We had our kind of colloquial kind of set strapline at the start of this conversation, but there's 3 characteristics that it has to be able to exhibit, and it has to exhibit it in its legal form. And this is why this conversation about your structure is so important, because if you can't evidence this in your structure, then you're not really a social enterprise. You may be massively ethical. You could have buckets of CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the environmental social governance stuff spewing out of every pore, but you're not a social enterprise. So you have to exhibit these 3 things, and they have to be protected. Now, this means you have to be incorporated. So many social entrepreneurs and social enterprises will start out as unincorporated. We will just do stuff. We'll register later, and that's fine, because you need to test your model. You need to make sure there's, as Matthew said, there's a market, there's a demand. So get that going first, and then kind of backfill it. But until you can incorporate, you cannot lock in and establish these characteristics. And they're on screen. So number one, you exist to do a good thing by trading. And that's different to a charity. A charity exists to do a good thing. Trading is optional. A social enterprise has to be trading, enterprise as well as social. And then what it does with that trading is the profits it generates, the assets it builds up, the stuff. Assets are stuff. Money in the bank, helicopters, intellectual property. Those are protected. Those have all been developed for that social purpose, so they can only be used for that social purpose. And you have to be incorporated in order to be regulated, which means you have a regulatory body, someone keeping an eye on things that you are holding true to those commitments, to that purpose. And the legal forms we've touched upon previously, that kind of timeline and the full 16, all of them can be hacked to lock those things into them, to protect them. And to have that assurance from a regulator, a government body, a legislative sanction, they can bring legal sanctions against you if you break them, to give you that assurance that we are who we think we are. And and like Matthew says, this may not be for you. You may go, you know what? I want to do good, I want to do right, but I can't sign up to these commitments. That's okay. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you like Marmite and we don't, or the other way around. You can still do good as private business, as community project, as charity. But this we're talking about here, this is the idea of social enterprise. We're distinct because we're the kind of the Wild West frontier. We're kind of going out and making stuff up, trying out new things, showing what's possible, challenging those conventions, creating dissent, to kind of coin one of Matthew's phrases. If you've not already subscribed, check out this Delightful Dissent, the YouTube channel and series. You should all watch it. It's really great. And then we can kind of scale it. But this is really important. Whatever your legal form, this is what it has to be able to protect for you, that purpose, that commitment to what you're trying to be.
I think that's great. And one of the big challenges with any uncertain space and any kind of complex space like this is that it's not obvious. The stuff isn't immediately obvious about what effect it has or the consequences. And as a result, lots of myths emerge. That myths emerge from uncertainty, from partial sightings and incomplete understanding. And then they become received wisdom. And then we assume we act on the basis that that they're true. There's a lot of claims and a lot of advice, and not all of it is trustworthy. Not all of it is testable. It's just out there. And some of it, you may find that you're engaging with people who are very insistent that you take that advice. Otherwise, they won't offer their support, which can make things very difficult. So having some evidence and some about some of the myths out there, and having
how very dare you be
I know,
subjective and honest.
I know, we're just entirely in a just opinion. So we're going to go through a few kind of myths around social enterprise based on the conversations that all of us had, and actually to some degree the certainly for me personally, some of the conclusions that I'd come to looking at other material around all of this so we're going to get into those now. So the first myth here is I can't make a living from a social enterprise.
Yeah, because there's this idea of saying, well, if all the money it generates has to be reinvested, has to go back to that social mission, I can't take any money to pay myself with. I said there's a distinction between a salary and a profit. A salary is a bill. You employ people to work with you. Why can't you be one of those employees? That's reasonable. Paying yourself £100,000 a year may be excessive, depending upon your industry and the size of the business. So it should be proportionate. It should be, there's a balance to be had. But you can pay yourself, absolutely, because you, as a person, need to be there. If you weren't there to do it, the business, the enterprise would have to employ someone else, and it would probably have to pay them. And so absolutely, you can be paid by it. And there are different ways of doing it. And it's just, I'm not sure where this idea comes from. I think it's maybe it's an overlap of charities, because as charities, charity law says a trustee, someone in the leadership of the charity, should not be employed by it, should not be paid by it. So there's that ethos of saying, well, it's a bit like a charity, and charities can't do that, so we shouldn't either. No, you can. It's fine.
And
I think
for me, sorry.
Just wanted to add, that is this named as a non-profit, not for profit. That is what I think might be sort of a little bit mixing some waters up. I don't know.
So I always get twitchy, Anita, when someone uses that phrase, not for profit. I always kind of say, you'll always be able to recognize me if we're ever at a conference or anything in real life, because I'll be the person starting a fight because someone said the phrase not for profit, and I'll have gone to slap them. And so for me, you're right, it's a shorthand that we use. We're trying to find that way to say we're different from other forms of creating change and doing business and working together. And I think it's very dangerous and misleading, because the way that the language is structured, not for profit, is very binary statement. If we are not this, then we must be that. If we are not for profit, then we must be for loss. And it goes back to your point, Matthew, that's an unsustainable business model.
Absolutely. And for me, a lot of, when we're talking about this particular case of working to address a problem that we ourselves experience, very often, almost by definition, if you're in a group that experiences a significant social problem, you're marginalized in that aspect of yourself, in your life. And the two kind of paths to resolving that feel like either meeting other people's kind of terms and how they think you should deal with this, how they think you should be, or actually being valued and valuing yourselves on your own terms and establishing that as important and valuable. And part of that is getting paid and making money and making a sustainable enterprise out of it. And that, for me, feels very, very relevant to both, is on an individual level and on a collective level. One of the attractive things for me around the social enterprise model is the idea that you might actually pay market rate as well. Which having worked in third sector and worked in higher education and various other organizations is not always something that's considered acceptable. And for me, particularly if you're employing and working as and with marginalized people, you should be paying a fair rate.
Yeah, and I think just sort of a little bit summing this up is that it's important not to be thrown off by the terminology and by the terms that kind of we find online, to really, really explore them properly, because don't take them at face value. They might not be what they seem they are. So.
Absolutely. So if we move on to the second myth, forming a social enterprise will let me get grants.
Yeah. I want to create change. I want to do good, but I need some money to help me do that. So I've heard if I do a social enterprise, there's grants to be had, so I'll do that. No. Grants exist because other people elsewhere have said, we want to try and have some impact, some interventions. And those bodies have their own rules about what those should be or not. I know of very few out there who say, just by the virtue of being a social enterprise, you can have some money. They're like, that rare partial sighting method, like the Loch Ness monster. We think it's there. We think someone thinks they saw one once, and the evidence is a bit, well, maybe it just doesn't happen. But if you want grants for what you're doing, and then you're obviously in the mindset of saying trading is not the viable option to getting out there. So pick a form that will help you better meet that model. If your model says we're going to be more dependent upon grants than on trading, then that's a charity. That's a traditional charity model. Be that. There's no shame in it. It will help you get there faster, better, sooner. But so many groups kind of say, oh, social enterprise, but get this, okay? So the evidence and research, I'm always interested in what the data says. the KIC regulator, the Community Interest Company regulator, in their annual report says the majority of KICs that they register will be wound up within 2 years. For the principal reason that they could not access the grants that they thought they could. They were led to believe. Like Anita says, they heard someone else say it online and they never tested it. So there is that huge thing of saying there are grants available, but there are grants available for private businesses, for goodness sake. The R&D tax credits. Government has innovation grants for privately owned for-profit businesses. So it's a big kind of, it always gets my back up, I'm afraid.
For me, it's to think about, I'm doing good, therefore funding comes from a certain place. Instead, the question is, where does it make sense to get funding from?
Yeah.
Because it's much more around, the big thing around charities and actually quite a lot of the other legal forms is that, not to get too technical, but you can't sell equity in them, which is, when I say equity, that means a chunk of the business, essentially, and the reason that people would buy a chunk of the business is very often because it will give them some form of return. It will give them something back for doing that. But there are many forms that don't let you do that for whatever reason. So that's, by choosing something like a charity that does get you greater access to grants, you are also not choosing another form of funding. And it's about matching the way that you're funding it to what you're trying to do.
And that's one of the things we've kind of got in our notes to be looking at in the next episode, to kind of understand that flip-flop of, if we go this way, we can't do that. But if we do that, we might be able to do this.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's sort of for the next episode as well, to go a bit deeper with sort of the trading and grants a little bit as well. And,
the important thing, I guess, here is really that grants are not the only way, and specific legal forms aren't necessarily the way to get specific grants. So the final one is relatedly, I need to find the perfect legal form. There's one answer out there and we need to find it, and that's the only thing that we, once we've solved this, it's all fine.
Yeah, it's the magic bullet, isn't it? If we do this, that we become... it's important. Okay, absolutely, because as we've picked up, going over the last kind of bit of time we've been sharing together here, if you get it wrong, it's potentially game over very quickly and in a very messy way. So there can be, we've got to get it absolutely. We're gonna, and like you were saying, Anita, I'm just going to get lost in all this stuff I'm reading, and I'm never going to make a decision. It's important to get it as right as you can, because you can always change it in the future. Whatever you start with, you are not wedded to forever. It is so. For example, a regular company, can transform into a community interest company or a charity under certain conditions. Okay? A community interest company can transform into a charity itself. So it goes. But what you start with and what you find you want to become in the future has varying degrees of difficulty. So better to get it as right as you can now and to protect it. But always say the world changes all the time. We're at the start of 2022 now. None of us, if we go back 3 years, none of us would have imagined what the last 2 years would have been like in terms of the impact. Came out of left field. Somebody sneezed, the world stopped. Everything started to be up for grabs. We came out of that, and then we thought, okay, we can start to get a handle on things. And then on the European bloc continent and in the borders with Russia, conflict suddenly appears. And that now is spilling over into the world again. There will always be things that force us to revisit our assumptions, and we should check back in it every so often. Any business, social enterprise or charity, every few years should say, are we still in the right place doing the right thing? But for now, you've just got to, do it.
It's picking one for now, isn't it? And I think the other thing for me is it can feel overwhelming when you're engaging with something as complex and important as the kind of things that very many people who want to start social enterprises are. It can feel like there's no way any one form can encapsulate all of this. And that might be true, but that doesn't mean that you can't do multiple ones or work with multiple ones depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm starting to explore increasingly, or seeing a demand from and people questioning, in my work across the wider sector is people saying, can we set up a social enterprise group? So it has a charity within it and a company within it and something else over here. And there's a shared purpose, but this allows us to say we get the most benefit from each legal form in all contributing and coalescing around that shared purpose and vision to create that change and impact. But that's really messy. Okay, so we're not
going to go into too much detail, but I think just remembering that change and impact and the importance of that, really.
Yeah, so, really starting somewhere. With all the doubts and everything, there won't be sort of complete clarity. Is that it's striving for good enough, really.
Well, there's a phrase in sort of a decision-making process called sociocracy, which is good enough for now and safe enough to try.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing. As long as if it feels okay and we can satisfy the people, ticks the box, crack on, move to that next step.
No,
So we're kind of, just to start to wrap things up, really, it's, we can potentially use these social enterprise forms as a model, as a vehicle to create this kind of change and do this kind of thing in a way that's safe enough and provides us with structure and support in an ongoing way that we couldn't necessarily get from other ones. And different ones do different things. They're not all the same at all. And also that what they do is a bit more subtle and a bit more involved than the very surface level that you might get the impression of from reading a little bit about it. Is there anything else really at that high level in terms of what a social enterprise is and why it matters that you'd like to add?
I think it's that point about it's part of the mix of options out there for how we can be, for how we can do, and that that range of options allows us to be much more connected with other people, whether we choose to do it as a social enterprise or as a sole trader or as a big private company. It gives us more connections, it gives us more options and opportunities, and that means we can be more creative and expressive, and ultimately, as Anita was sharing earlier, ties it back to saying we can be more of us, and that's surely a good thing.
Yeah, sort of having longer arms. Extending. Thank you.
I think for me, this idea of thinking about it as a vehicle for really positive deviance, which is such an important theme of my work, doing things differently and providing us with the scaffolding, the support and the structure that we really need to be able to do that safely enough and to give us what we need to kind of empower that and give us that ability, and using it consciously as a tool for that kind of thing. But it isn't the only way, and that there are other ways as well. So I think we've covered a high level of a lot of information here, and I wanted to share a few more bits where you can go into more depth if this does sound like an interesting topic and get some more information. The first one is Adrian's blog, which I'll let Adrian talk about.
So my blog is a place where my brain just overflows and spills out. So some of the things that I post about are about this question of legal structure and form, because I hear people make claims, I hear regulators say things, and I fact check them. Not as a public service, but just to kind of assure myself, what's this based on? So we've kind of shared the link here, because if you're hearing things, like Anita was saying, if you go and read stuff and you're trying to figure out, how do I take a note? How do I figure out how to test this stuff? Hopefully, the idea of the blog is it's structured. I've shown how I approach this. I've put the links onto all the different places you can go to find these things. So you can then start to figure out, okay, that's how I can approach asking better questions, or questions I feel more confident when I find the answers to.
Brilliant. And the second source, the Co-ops UK.
So this kind of sits on the Co-ops UK's website. You just pop it into Google or your search engine, it'll come up. This for me is at the moment, the best, most comprehensive, plain English reference guide to all the legal forms, summary pros and cons, case studies, little flowchart diagrams, and it's free.
Brilliant. And finally, the Good Business Club, which is a community specifically for good businesses, social enterprise, and it's where without them, I'm not sure we'd be having this conversation. Certainly not in this form. So it's a really good place to connect with others and to get some support along the journey. So you can check them out at thegoodbusinessclub.com. We've covered an awful lot of technical kind of information here, and the next bit is we're going to talk about how we can figure out how this applies to you in your specific situation. Tools you can use to start narrowing down all of these very complicated technical options and their implications, and really start to feel confident in any decision that you make around adopting a structure or what structure you want to choose. We'll be looking at Adrian's own framework to help with this, and a whole load of more stuff. So I very much hope for you to join us then. Do ask questions if you have any, and get in touch with us in comments and variously. And if you ask questions soon, you might well get those questions answered as part of the next episode. So please do check it out and see us then. I want to say thank you very much, Adrian and Anita, for joining me today, and I hope that was useful to everyone in the audience, and I look forward to seeing you on the second episode. Thanks and goodbye.